Hello and welcome to our video, summarizing all you need to know about the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. This video is really useful, especially if you're studying about the Soviet Union as part of your exams or coursework, as we will go into the details you need to know to get top marks. So let's get started. 1922, Formation and the New Economic Policy. The Soviet Union had its roots in the 1917 October Revolution, when the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, overthrew the Russian provisional government which had replaced Tsar Nicholas II during World War I. After the Civil War ended in 1921, protests against war communism in Russia threatened to overthrow the communist parties, formed mainly of Bolsheviks' control. The Soviet Union was in crisis, and Lenin responded with the new economic policy. The main features of the new economic policy included: the free market was reintroduced. Peasants could now sell their produce for a price which they set themselves. The state stopped requisitioning grain and other crops. Money was reintroduced. The state kept control of the big factories, but small businesses and farms could be privately owned. Foreign experts were brought in to improve how factories were run. The new economic policy was popular with peasants and workers. Although wealthier peasants gained the most from it, all peasants preferred freedom to sell rather than being requisitioned. However, many Communist Party members did not like the new economic policy, as it seemed to be a backward step towards capitalism. It also gave peasants what they wanted at the expense of the workers. Beyond the new economic policy, many social changes took place in the Soviet Union between 1918 and 1924, including the Zenotdel, a women's organization, was set up to increase freedom, equality, and impose the influence of women on society. However, the Zenotdel's demands for democracy were fundamentally opposed by Lenin, leading to less influence in government than they desired. Abortion was made legal, a campaign which was enabled by increased literary standards of women who were offered Civil War literacy campaigns. Girls and boys were now taught together. 1924 to 1953, Joseph Stalin as a leader. After Lenin's death in 1924, 4 years of power struggle took place among senior communists to become leader of the Soviet Union. However, due to several key steps that he took, Joseph Stalin was eventually elected as a leader. Factors that led to Stalin's rise: he made sure that he took the lead role at Lenin's funeral, which his rival Trotsky was too ill to attend, thereby positioning himself as Lenin's natural successor. Worked with other contenders, Kamenev and Zinoviev, to undermine Trotsky, before turning on the pair and accusing them of trying to split the party. Turned away from the much critiqued new economic policy in 1927 and instead argued for the popular prospect of rapid industrialization. Once Stalin was in power, he engaged in several repressive techniques in order to consolidate his authority, including the secret police. Stalin used the OCPU, a new version of the Cheka, who later became known as the KGB. Gulags, labor camps which were a new version of Bolshevik prison camps. Terror, created a similar climate of fear to that of the Civil War. People were arrested in the middle of the night, deprived of sleep and tortured. 1928 to 1933, the era of collectivization. Collectivization was Stalin's solution to the economic and ideological problems of peasant agriculture in the Soviet Union. The reasons for collectivization were concerns about the new economic policy, which favored individual capitalist ideology, communist ideology, which stated that peasant farming should have disappeared by 1928 under a genuine communist system of production, falling grain production, stalling industrial production, and Stalin's rival, Bukharin, supported the new economic policy, so attacking it was politically valuable for him. Steps towards collectivization. The state took control of the land and equipment. The state regulated production targets for each individual farm. All collective farm workers were organized and made to work regulated hours. Collective farms were mechanized by machine tractor stations, which were monitored by secret police. In March 1930, Stalin published his article, Dizzy with Success. In the article, he called for a temporary halt to collectivization, claiming that the collectivization quota outlined in his 5-year plan had been reached, and that some of our comrades have become dizzy with success, and for the moment have lost clearness of mind and sobriety of vision. By April 1930, the Gulag was officially established. Correctional forced labor camps had been used previously but were now named. They were to be used to house those individuals that were a threat to or disrupted the functioning of the Soviet state. 1932-33, the second 5-year plan. Stalin announced that his first 5-year plan, introduced in 1928, had been such a success that he was ending it a year early. The first 5-year plan had seen an increase in the production of raw materials, iron, steel. The Russian economy had grown by around 14% per year. The urban population trebled as peasants moved to cities to work in factories. Members of the working class became managers or retrained as engineers. A struggle to meet targets because of inefficiency and poor production. Working conditions worsened with the introduction of a 7-day working week and unsafe labor standards. Many local administrators falsifying production figures. Those that failed to meet targets being sacked, exiled, and even executed as enemies of the state. The move to eliminate free trade saw the establishment of a black market trade in consumer goods. January 1933 saw the beginning of Stalin's second 5-year plan. The plan proposed to continue to increase industrial production in raw materials like iron and steel, to improve communications and infrastructure, increase production of electricity and consumer goods, introduce new industries. Stalin also stated that socialism did not mean wage equality and that incentives for hard work were essential in the new Russia. Trotsky. During Stalin's movement towards collectivism, Trotsky was exiled from the Soviet Union, seeking refuge in Turkey and publishing anti-Stalin material. In 1929, Trotsky was found guilty of being a counter-revolutionary and was banished from the Soviet Union. He was given refuge in Turkey and settled near Istanbul. While in Turkey, he published his History of the Russian Revolution. In 1934, Trotsky moved to France after the left-wing government agreed to give refuge to those exiled from the Soviet Union. However, the move faced strong opposition from the French Communist Party when Trotsky tried to rally support to overthrow Stalin. Trotsky also tried to encourage German communists to rise against Hitler and fascism in Germany. As a result, the German government put pressure on France to expel Trotsky. Timeline of wartime events. March 1938. The trial of the 21 was the third show trial that accused rightists and Trotskyists of attempting to overthrow socialism and complicity in the murder of Kirov. Among those accused were former head of the NKVD, Yagoda, Bukharin, and Krestinsky. Bukharin was also charged with attempting to assassinate Lenin. All those that had been close to Lenin during the years of Lenin's communism were now dead. August 1938, Beria was appointed deputy to Yesev, head of the NKVD. With Stalin's approval, he began to take over Yezev's role. October 1938, edited by Stalin himself, the short course of the history of the All-Union Communist Party was published. The book erased Trotsky from the party history and also highlighted the contributions made by Stalin to the Communist Party. November 1938. Yesev asked to be relieved from his role as People's Commissioner for Internal Affairs. He was succeeded by Beria. 1939. The State Planning Committee, Gosplan, ordered construction of 9 new aircraft factories. 1939. Stalin announced the end of the Great Terror, which was a 2-year period of wide-scale repression. August 1939. The Nazi-Soviet Pact was agreed in Moscow. The treaty officially agreed to maintain a non-aggression stance and increase trade between themselves. Privately, the treaty agreed to divide Eastern Europe between themselves and Germany taking Western Poland and Czechoslovakia. September 1939. Hitler invaded Poland, prompting the beginning of World War II. April 1940. In April, around 15,000 Polish army officers were murdered in the Katyn forest. August 1940. Trotsky was assassinated by Stalin's agents in Mexico. April 1941. Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Japan. June 1941. The third 5-year plan came to an end. Later that month, Hitler invaded Russia under the Operation Barbarossa. Although Stalin knew that Hitler would break the Nazi-Soviet Pact and invade Russia, he had not expected the invasion until mid-1942 at the earliest. Consequently, the Soviet army was not prepared and was initially pushed back. Summer 1941. Stalin ordered a purge of military intelligence personnel to find those responsible for not discovering Hitler's plans to invade Russia. The Soviet army was in a very difficult position. It was facing war with Germany while at the same time facing purges and poor supplies. September 1941. Hitler launched Operation Typhoon, a bid to capture Moscow. With the Germans advancing on the city, the people panicked, which led to rioting and looting. November 1941. The American Lend-Lease scheme was open to the Soviet Union. While it had little impact on industrial production, it was useful in increasing food supplies and transport. Stalin was reluctant to use Lend-Lease since many American-made goods were of much better quality than Russian-produced goods, thus proving that capitalism was superior to communism, something he did not want to do. December 1941. General Zhukov successfully managed to counterattack the Germans and push them back some 200 kilometers from Moscow. May 1942. Churchill signed a treaty of alliance with Stalin. June 1942. Hitler launched Operation Blue, an attempt to capture Stalingrad. August 1942. The Battle of Stalingrad began. September 1942. The Soviets launched a counteroffensive at Stalingrad, Operation Uranus. February 1943. The Germans were defeated at Stalingrad. November 1943. Stalin attended the Tehran Conference with Churchill and Roosevelt. December 1943. The Germans had been driven back and 2/3 of German-occupied territory had been reclaimed. January 1945. Soviet forces had entered Germany and were advancing steadily. 4th to 11th February 1945. The Yalta Conference. The Yalta Conference was a meeting between Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt to discuss the details of the end of the war. It was agreed, among other things, that Germany and Berlin would be divided into 4 occupied zones: Soviet, British, French and American. Prisoners of war would be returned to their country of origin. Poland would be allowed to stage free elections. April 1945. Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. The Russian Red Army had reached the outskirts of Berlin, and Hitler did not want to be captured by the Russians. May 1945. Stalin's Soviet Red Army had now occupied East Germany, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, Poland, Bulgaria, and Albania, in addition to the entire Soviet Union, which included the former Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarusia, Ukraine, and Moldova. Post-Second World War Soviet Union. World War II left the Soviet Union, especially in western regions, in a catastrophic state of ruin. Some of the destruction was intentional. Stalin issued a scorched earth policy to deprive the Germans of usable loot as they advanced on Moscow in 1941. The same earth was scorched again by Germans as they retreated 2 years later. More than 1,700 towns and some 70,000 villages had been all but wiped off the map, along with around 32,000 factories and 65,000 kilometers of railway track. There were no men, no working machinery, and no livestock, and the failure of harvests led to devastating famine during the war, but also in the years immediately after 1945. While Europe was being aided by the Marshall Plan, the USSR and its satellite states rejected American financial assistance, but despite this, the Soviet economy rapidly returned to growth. One element in the success of this post-war 5-year rebuilding plan was mass, often forced, manpower. There were between 10 and 11 million Soviet men returning from the front to help rebuild, and they were joined by at least 2 million German prisoners of war, as well as around the same number of Soviet dissidents held prisoner in Stalin's Gulag army. Reparations from Germany, mainly seized industrial assets, also played their part in reconstruction efforts. The Cold War origins, 1941 to 1958. There were three big alliances from World War II: Britain, the USA, and the USSR. They were also known as the Grand Alliance. Their aim was to defeat Nazi Germany. However, as the war ended, tensions arose. In 1943, the Grand Alliance focused on plans to defeat the Nazis. The three superpowers, Britain, the USA, and the USSR, were politically different. However, there were still tensions between the three, although these tensions were put aside while they fought Nazi Germany. The Grand Alliance made decisions about the future of Europe, which included free elections, the United Nations, which would replace the failed League of Nations. In May 1945, after Germany surrendered, the Allied leaders met again at Potsdam over July and August. They wanted to work on the finer details of their plans for Germany and the rest of Europe. These are some of the important agreements which were made at Potsdam. The new boundaries of Poland were agreed. The Big Three plus France would divide Germany and Berlin between them. Nazi leaders would be tried for war crimes at Nuremberg. Germany would be divided into 4 zones, one for each for Britain, France, the USA, and the USSR, but the Allies didn't decide if or when the zones could rejoin and form a country again. Roosevelt had died and Harry Truman had succeeded him as the US president. Truman was more suspicious of the USSR and less willing to compromise. Britain and the US were also alarmed by Stalin's actions in Poland. He had installed a government consisting of only the pro-communist members. Britain and the US felt that this went against the Yalta Agreement. The tension between the US and the USSR was partly caused by their very different beliefs. The USSR was communist, while the US was capitalist. Both countries also feared each other's intentions. Communism meant state control of industry and agriculture. The US, by contrast, valued private enterprise. The American dream was that anyone could work their way to the top. Further, the USSR only allowed one political party, the Communist Party. The USA valued political freedom. Communism aimed at a world revolution, and so it was seen by Americans as a threat to their democracy. However, the communists also feared worldwide American influence. The USA kept their atom bomb a secret. Japan was on Germany's side in the war and continued to fight after Germany surrendered in May 1945. In August 1945, the US dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, destroying the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atom bombs meant that military help from the USSR wasn't needed to defeat Japan. President Truman also refused to allow the USSR to take part in the US occupation of Japan. The US had kept the exact nature of the atom bombs a secret from the USSR at Potsdam in July 1945, although Stalin's spies had passed on many details. These nuclear weapons boosted the status of the United States. For 4 years, it was the world's only nuclear power. Stalin saw the development of the atom bomb as an attempt to intimidate the USSR and was angry that the US had managed to surpass the Soviet technology. The USSR sped up the development of its own atomic bomb, starting an arms race between the two countries. The USSR became influential in Eastern Europe. At the end of the Second World War, the Red Army occupied Eastern Europe. These countries would pass into the USSR's sphere of influence after the war. Between 1945 and 48, Stalin installed pro-Soviet puppet governments in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia. For a while it seemed that Czechoslovakia might remain democratic, but when the Communist Party seemed likely to lose ground in the next election, it seized power in February 1948. The exception to Soviet domination was Yugoslavia, which had freed itself from the Germans without the Red Army. Yugoslavia was communist but more open to the West. Its leader, Tito, argued with Stalin over political interference. Stalin thus cut off aid but did not invade. The Iron Curtain. Increasing tensions between the US and the USSR became known as the Cold War. There was no direct fighting involved. Both sides were afraid of another war, especially after 1949 when the USSR had its own nuclear weapons. Countries in Western Europe tended to support the US. Most countries in Eastern Europe were dominated by the USSR. In a famous speech in 1946, Winston Churchill warned there was an Iron Curtain dividing Europe. The Cold War was a period of international tension, with each side suspicious of the other. The Long and Novikov telegrams. By 1946, tensions between the superpowers were high. Each country issued secret telegrams about the other. 1946 telegrams were detailed reports describing the motivations and intentions of the other country. Neither country seemed to know for certain what the other was thinking. The reports panicked the Russian and American governments and accelerated the Cold War. The findings seemed to confirm their worst fears. The Long Telegram, issued to President Truman about the USSR. It is said that Stalin had given a speech in favor of the destruction of capitalism. It is warned of the USSR trying to weaken and divide Western powers while building the strength of its own military. The Novikov telegram, issued to Stalin about the US, the report claimed that USA was pursuing world supremacy. It warned that the USA was trying to limit the influence of the USSR in Europe. March 1947, the Truman Doctrine. The USA pledged to support any nation threatened by a communist takeover. This support could be diplomatic, military, or financial. For example, the US gave $400 million of aid to Turkey and Greece to stop communism from spreading there. June 1947, the Marshall Plan. This promised $17 billion of aid to European countries to help rebuild their economies. The areas of Germany under Western occupation benefited massively. Stalin, however, ordered all of his satellite states to reject the plan. He believed the USA was using economic incentives to lure Eastern European states away from the USSR. The USSR reacted by creating the Cominform. The Cominform, Communist Information Bureau, was set up in 1947. The organization brought together all European Communist parties and placed them under the control of the USSR. The Comecon, the Council for the Mutual Economic Assistance, was established in 1949. It countered the Marshall Plan by nationalizing industries, collectivizing agriculture, and offering economic aid. Stalin hoped this would encourage economic development in Eastern Europe and discourage trade with the West. It also appeased the countries that had been ordered to refuse Marshall aid. 1948, the Berlin Crisis. Tension over the division of Germany had been building since the Potsdam Conference and finally spilled over in the Berlin Crisis in 1948. It resulted in an even larger rift between the two great powers. In 1948, the USSR and West clashed over Berlin. Immediately after the war, there were 4 zones of occupied Germany and 4 zones in Berlin. In 1947, the USA and Britain agreed to combine their zones to form Bizonia. The next year, the French agreed to add their zone. The new Western Zone had a single government and in June 1948 introduced a new currency to help economic recovery. This alarmed the USSR. Stalin did not want a unified Western Zone on his doorstep. West Berlin's strong capitalist economy embarrassed the USSR and made communism look weak. As a result, Stalin decided to blockade Berlin. In June 1948, he ordered that all road, rail, and canal links between West Berlin and the outside world should be cut off. The arms race. In the Cold War, the US and the USSR tried to gain an advantage by forming military alliances and developing ever more powerful weapons. The aim was to look strong, to deter the other from attacking. The US and USSR began an arms race. Neither side really wanted to use these weapons, but both felt the other couldn't be allowed to gain an advantage. The fear was that if either gained a significant military advantage, that country might be tempted to trigger a war to take advantage of it. Instead, a standoff developed where both countries did not dare to act against the other, but didn't dare get left behind either. This competition sometimes spilled over into other areas. For example, when the USSR launched the first satellite into space, the USA quickly developed one of its own. This space race led to the USSR sending the first man into space in 1961 and to the USA sending astronauts to the moon in 1969. Both countries developed nuclear stockpiles. The arms race was also fueled by the fear and suspicion created by other events. The formation of NATO in 1949 made the USSR feel militarily vulnerable. In February 1950, Communist China and the USSR signed a treaty of alliance, which strengthened Western fears about the USSR. 1953 to 1964, Khrushchev's rise and fall. In 1953, Stalin died and another member of the Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev, took power. Khrushchev said he wanted peaceful coexistence with the West. His words brought hope that there would be a thaw in the Cold War. But Khrushchev remained very competitive with the USA. He wanted communism to spread, but thought that the best way to achieve this was to clearly demonstrate its superiority, not defeat the West in a war. After the fall of the Third Reich, the USSR also absorbed part of the German province of East Prussia. Then when Japan surrendered, parts of the Japanese Empire followed, namely Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, which Japan still does not recognize as Russian territory. At the same time, the Soviet Union consolidated its control all over Eastern and parts of Central Europe, its sphere of influence. The battle lines were set for the Cold War and the confrontation of a new world superpower, the USSR and its arch-enemy, the USA. One of Khrushchev's best-known acts was a secret speech delivered to the Communist Party's 20th Annual Congress in February 1956. In this speech, Khrushchev denounced many aspects of the Stalinist era and urged a return to the original principles of Lenin. The new Soviet leader attacked the personality cult employed by Stalin and the lack of consultation and collective decision-making during his reign, Stalin's attack on leading Bolsheviks, the victimization of nationalist groups, and Stalin's paranoia about plots and conspiracies. Above all, Khrushchev condemned Stalin's systematic use of murder and intimidation, targeting those who disagreed with his policies. This speech caused a sensation and heralded the beginning of more relaxed policies in the USSR. For a brief period, it seemed as though Khrushchev might be a more open, liberal leader, someone whom the West could deal with. Within months, however, Soviet forces had crossed the border and crushed the Hungarian uprising. In November 1956, Khrushchev employed belligerent and threatening Cold War rhetoric, delivering his famous "We will bury you" threat to foreign ambassadors in Moscow. Khrushchev's domestic policies. Economically, he attempted to decentralize industry and manufacturing by relaxing national quotas and establishing regional economic councils. Khrushchev also sought to avoid the disastrous famines caused by Stalin's collectivization. Soviet farmers were given greater freedom to grow their own produce, while payments for crops requisitioned by the state were increased. Khrushchev also planned to increase food output by cultivating almost 150,000 square kilometers of untouched land. Khrushchev's policies did raise living standards in many parts of Russia. However, the outcomes were inconsistent and often failed to meet targets. Khrushchev also wound back Stalinist systems of control and oppression, though the state still engaged in limited censorship and retained control of the press. Eastern Europe. Some satellite states hoped that their countries would also become de-Stalinized. Khrushchev abolished the Cominform, meaning that states in Eastern Europe would have more political and economic freedom from the USSR. These moves allowed tensions in the satellite states to rise to the surface. Not all states had chosen communism and saw the changes as a chance to loosen ties with the USSR. In 1956, there was an uprising in Poland. The USSR threatened to intervene, but eventually allowed the new government to follow. Poland formed their own version of communism. This encouraged other states to consider revolt. This led to the Hungarian uprising of 1956. After the Second World War, the USSR helped put Matyas Rákosi, a brutal Stalinist, in charge of Hungary. His authoritarian regime became increasingly unpopular. In October 1956, the people of Budapest protested against the government of Rákosi. Khrushchev allowed the liberal Imre Nagy to take over from Rákosi as Hungarian Prime Minister. Nagy hoped that Hungary could be a neutral state. In November 1956, Nagy announced that Hungary would withdraw from the Warsaw Pact and hold free elections, ending communism there. If Hungary was allowed to turn away from communism, other satellite states might do the same. The USSR felt it had to respond with force and make an example of Hungary. Khrushchev, who had only held power for 2 years at the time, wanted to use the crisis to assert his authority. Soviet tanks invaded Hungary in November 1956. Thousands of Hungarians were killed or wounded, and Nagy was arrested and hanged. János Kadar became Prime Minister and ensured loyalty to the USSR. Khrushchev's brutal response to Hungary demonstrated to satellite states that disloyalty won't be tolerated. It also showed the Western powers that the USSR was still in control. It was a turning point for Khrushchev. His actions reasserted his authority over the satellite states and destroyed any illusions in the West that his leadership signified a thaw in the Cold War. There was a lack of intervention from Western countries. They condemned the USSR's actions but thought that helping Hungary would risk a nuclear war. The UN asked the USSR to withdraw from Hungary, but Kadar refused to take part in discussions. The situation remained unresolved. Khrushchev's fall. Khrushchev's leadership lasted until 1964. In the early 1960s, he was confronted with new challenges in the Soviet bloc and new American leadership. Khrushchev believed newly elected US President John F. Kennedy was too young and weak to handle confrontation, an assumption shattered by Kennedy's firmness during the Berlin Crisis in 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Relations between the two powers eased in 1963 to 64. During this period, Khrushchev's main problems were closer to home. Soviet hardliners, disappointed with Khrushchev's ambivalence and inability to gain ground on the inexperienced Kennedy, sought to oust him from power. Khrushchev spent most of 1964 out of Moscow, giving his opponents ample opportunity to organize. In October 1964, Khrushchev was summoned to a meeting with members of the Politburo and persuaded to retire from office. Brezhnev, Gorbachev, and the end of the Cold War. 1964 to 1982. Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev was born to a Russian workers' family in the Russian Empire, now Ukraine. After the invasion by Germany in 1941, he joined the army and held increasingly important political posts as the Communist Party closely monitored the generals. After the war, he rose steadily in the top ranks of the party and became a protege of Joseph Stalin. In 1952, Brezhnev was promoted to the Central Committee and in 1957 to full member of the Politburo. In 1964, he ousted Nikita Khrushchev and took over as first secretary of the CPSU, the most powerful position in the Kremlin. Domestic policies. Repression. Brezhnev's stabilization policy included ending the liberalizing reforms of Khrushchev and clamping down on cultural freedom. During the Khrushchev years, Brezhnev had supported the leader's denunciations of Stalin's arbitrary rule, the rehabilitation of many of the victims of Stalin's purges, and the cautious liberalization of Soviet intellectual and cultural policy. But as soon as he became leader, Brezhnev began to reverse this process and developed an increasingly totalitarian and regressive attitude. Economic policies. He came into power at a time when the USSR had managed to industrialize, increase its arms, and develop new technology. However, it had failed in the production of consumer goods and agriculture. However, standards of living, which had been previously increasing, were starting to decrease again. A lot of money was being spent on the military and space program. Brezhnev wanted to increase consumer goods and agriculture by putting in place reforms that would use the market force to increase these. However, he was prevented from doing so, as some feared that these would lead to a tendency towards capitalism. Brezhnev rejected Stalin's system of collectivization, allowing farmers to tend their own plots in order to encourage growth and surplus economic value. Political policies. Brezhnev did not have much interest in reforming the government or the stabilized party structure. It became more and more apparent that there was a need for reform as the government leaders and ministers were aging and starting to die. In 1974, Brezhnev spoke about stability of the cadres and assured the older stagnant party members that they would not lose their positions. Workers also realized that they would not lose their jobs due to poor productivity. Even though this brought about a sense of security, it had devastating effects on the economy. Brezhnev and the Cold War. Brezhnev was at the forefront of the Prague Spring in 1968, where there was opposition to Soviet control in Czechoslovakia. Dubček, the Czech PM, wanted to move away from the Soviet policies. The USSR was under pressure to intervene. In August 1968, the USSR invaded Czechoslovakia. The Prague Spring strengthened the USSR. However, tensions between the USSR and America eased in the 1970s. Due to the economic situation in the USSR, Brezhnev wanted to come to an agreement with the USA on arm limitations. This also showed the US that USSR wanted to avoid nuclear war. In 1969, the strategic arms limitation talks began between the Brezhnev and the US President Nixon. In May 1972, the USA and the USSR came to an agreement on arms limitations. The Helsinki Final Act in 1975 finalized the post-war frontiers in Central and Eastern Europe, and the Soviets agreed to comply with international conventions on human rights. Brezhnev's death in 1982 saw him succeeded by Yuri Andropov, who led between 1982 and February 1984. Andropov was a former KGB leader and a Central Committee member, managed to outmaneuver Chernenko, who had been Brezhnev's closest advisor and had made key decisions on international and domestic policy in the latter years of Brezhnev's reign, and he became the leader of the USSR. He tried to answer the problem of economic stagnation by putting in place policies which stated that those illegally absent from work would be arrested, closed most of the Soviet space program in 1983 to try and cut down expenses. He wanted to replace the older party members with younger ones with the help of Mikhail Gorbachev. The relation between the US and the USSR was already bad, but it was made worse when in September 1983, the Soviets shot down a Korean Airlines flight that had strayed into Soviet airspace. February 1984 to March 1985. Konstantin Chernenko. When Andropov died in 1984, he was succeeded by Chernenko. There were not many changes under Chernenko's leadership. Foreign and domestic policies stayed the same. Chernenko's health deteriorated quite fast, and he needed to rely more and more on his deputy, Gorbachev. When Chernenko died in March 1985, it marked the end of the Brezhnev era. 1985 to 1991. Gorbachev and the collapse of the Soviet Union. After a rapid turnover of leaders, after Brezhnev's death, the Soviet Union decided that it wanted a younger leader who could last longer than the previous ones. So the Central Committee decided to elect Gorbachev as the General Secretary. Key factors that led to collapse. Perestroika. Gorbachev loosened centralized control of many businesses, allowing some farmers and manufacturers to decide for themselves which products they wanted to make, how many to produce, and what to charge for them. This incentivized them to aim for profits, but also went against the strict price controls that had been the bedrock of Soviet economic policies. It was a move that rankled many high-ranking officials who had previously headed these powerful central committees. In May 1988, Gorbachev introduced a new policy that allowed for the creation of limited cooperative businesses within the Soviet Union, which led to the rise of privately owned stores, restaurants, and manufacturers. Not since the short-lived new economic policy of Vladimir Lenin, instituted in 1922, after the Russian Civil War, had aspects of free market capitalism been permitted in the USSR. Second, relaxed trade restrictions. Gorbachev also peeled back restrictions on foreign trade, streamlining processes to allow manufacturers and local government agencies to bypass the previously stifling bureaucratic system of the central government. He encouraged Western investment, although he later reversed his original policy, which called for these new business ventures to be majority Russian-owned and operated. Gorbachev also showed initial restraint when laborers began to push for increased protections and rights, with thousands protesting the wild inefficiencies of the Soviet coal industry. But he again reversed course when faced with pressure from hardliners after a massive strike by 300,000 miners in 1991. Economic policies. While Gorbachev had instituted these reforms to jumpstart the sluggish Soviet economy, many of them had the opposite effect. The agricultural sector, for example, had provided food at low cost, thanks to decades of heavy government subsidies. Now, it could charge higher prices in the marketplace, prices many Soviets could not afford. Government spending and Soviet debt skyrocketed, and pushed by workers for higher wages led to dangerous inflation. If Gorbachev faced opposition from the entrenched hardliners that he was moving too far, too fast, he was criticized for doing just the opposite by others. Some liberals called for full-fledged abolishment of central planning committees entirely, which Gorbachev resisted. Political reforms. As reforms under Glasnost revealed both the horrors of the Soviet past and its present-day inefficiencies, Gorbachev moved to remake much of the political system of the USSR. At a party meeting in 1988, he pushed through measures calling for the first truly democratic elections since the Russian Revolution of 1917. Hardliners who supported this initially believed that the date for these elections would be far enough in the future that they could control the process. Instead, Gorbachev announced that they would be held just months later. The resulting campaign for the new Congress of People's Deputies was remarkable. While some Communist Party members reserved many of the seats for themselves, other hardliners went down to defeat at the ballot box to liberal reformers. Former dissidents and prisoners, including Nobel laureate physicist and activist Andrei Sakharov, were elected as candidates waged Western-style campaigns. When the new Congress met for its first session in May 1989, newspapers, television and radio stations, newly empowered by the lifting of press restrictions under Glasnost, devoted hours of time to the meetings, which featured open conflict between conservatives and liberals. Opposition. But as with economic reforms, many of these newly elected reformers used their platforms to criticize what they still considered limited change, and the pushback by hardliners was just as fierce. In March 1988, the largest newspaper in the Soviet Union published a full-throttled attack on Gorbachev by chemist and social critic Nina Andreeva. The article, "I Cannot Forsake My Principles," was likely written with the tacit approval of several members of the Politburo, the highest echelon of Communist Party, and was seen as an attempt to destabilize Gorbachev. Gorbachev's additional reforms, which allowed for the creation of political parties and increasingly shifted autonomy and control to local and regional bodies rather than the central government, weakened his own base of support as the Communist Party lost its monopoly on political power in the vast expanse of Soviet Union. Global events. Gorbachev held firm on a promise to end Soviet involvement in a war in Afghanistan, which the USSR invaded in 1979. After 10 controversial years and nearly 15,000 Soviet deaths, troops fully withdrew in 1989. The Soviets began increasingly engaging with the West, and Gorbachev forged key relationships with leaders including British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, West German leader Helmut Kohl, and most famously, President Ronald Reagan. It was with the staunchly anti-communist Reagan that Gorbachev, a new kind of communist leader, achieved a series of landmark agreements, including the 1987 INF Treaty that eliminated all intermediate-range nuclear weapons in Europe. The Soviet Union officially dissolved on 25 December 1991, effectively ending the 40-year-long Cold War with the United States. The Soviet Union's failing post-World War II economy and weakened military, along with public dissatisfaction with Soviet President Gorbachev's loosened economic and political policies of perestroika and glasnost, contributed to its ultimate collapse. So that's all for now. If you found this video useful, we would really love it if you could give it a thumbs up. Also, do subscribe to our channel where we offer lots of free material that you can use as part of your studies to get a better understanding of specific areas that you might find challenging. Also, if you need more information either on this topic or more generally for other areas in your course, make sure to visit our website, which is www.firstratetutors.com. There you will find useful revision guides, model answers and tools that you can use to get top marks in your coursework or exams. Thank you for listening.